Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this lovely day, Thursday. Just wanted to say again, thank you for taking the time to tune in to our Leadership Support Webinar series. This is our third one in a series of more to come for sure. And I think really today's conversation is very timely and very relevant with everything that's going on in the world. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ash to take us through today's webinar.
Thank you, Sandra. So good morning, everyone. My name is Ash Couillard, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's webinar on difficult conversations, bringing peace into a pandemic, which is needed more now than ever. So before we get started, I'm just going to begin the webinar by going over some webinar housekeeping. So the webinar will be approximately 45 minutes in length, and you will notice that there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to use that to ask any questions, and we will have time throughout the presentation and at the end for a Q&A. You will also see that there's a chat box at the bottom of your screen. So we do encourage you to engage throughout the webinar, ask any questions, participate. And if you're open to it, just select all panelists and attendees so that we're all able to engage with one another. All of the webinars are recorded and posted to our HHS YouTube page for later viewing, and so the link is there for you. And if there is someone who you think that would benefit from this webinar or enjoy this, please feel free to share with your colleagues, and you will be receiving the recorded webinar in the Leadership Learning Bite on June the 11th. So before we get started and dive into today's topic on difficult conversations, as a group, I would just encourage us to stop, pause, and reflect on the state of affairs in our world and the traumatic impact that anti-Black racism and violence is having on Black people globally, locally, and here at HHS. At this time, I would just invite us to do a reflective practice, and I'm inviting you to think about how racism is showing up in our walls and how that impacts our staff, physicians, and patients. I will let you sit with that without judgment and just curiosity. My next task is for folks to think about what might be holding you back from having difficult conversations about racism. And if you're open to it, please take a moment to share one word in the chat box about what may be holding you back from these conversations. And again, with curiosity and no judgment. The reason I'm having us reflect on racism within our walls is because we are not immune to racism in Canada, in Hamilton, or at HHS. And when we have the courage and build our capacity to have conversations about racism, we can really move the dial to enact change. Notably, this week, we saw that Rob McIsaac and Bruce Squires took a stance on anti-Black racism. And what was clear from their statements was, as a healthcare organization, it is our responsibility to take action if we want to have a meaningful change for racialized folks. There is also an opportunity to email any recommendations to the Human Rights and Inclusion team at inclusion@hhsc.ca. As a white person, I can appreciate how hard it can be to take the first step in anti-racist allyship. You may feel clunky, awkward, uncertain. I'm seeing fear, reactions that might occur, uncertainty. These are all so valid. And while I can appreciate the latter, we can no longer afford to be silent on systemic issues that impact the health of our colleagues, our patients, families, and our Black community. And if we want equity-seeking colleagues and patients to be able to be their authentic selves and to thrive in the spaces we work and provide care, we have to begin to acknowledge and have the courage to have difficult conversations about the deep roots of systemic discrimination. Because racism is a public health crisis that exists across the world, here in Canada, and the impacts on health have been long known. You may be wondering, what can we do to support? What are tangible steps we can take as leaders in the pursuit of anti-Black racism? There are different ways allyship can look and feel, and I invite all of us to consider to take action. Ultimately, the goal is to start somewhere and continue to build your capacity to have these difficult conversations. You may consider checking in with your Black staff at this time. Example, how can I support you? How have you been sleeping? What do you need from me as your leader? What would you like to take some time off work? And just notice, because people are suffering right now and they may just not ask. And this is a really traumatic time for Black folks, and checking in can really mean a lot. You may consider how you can offer support during this time and what support may look like in your role, and continue to support when the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other Black folks no longer have the public's attention. Learn about the ways in which racism exists within our country. Anti-racism is not an identity or a checklist. It is an ongoing journey and a commitment to uprooting the ways in which white supremacy exists within our systems and the relationships that we navigate each day. Try to be open to listening to the voices who often go unheard with the intent to understand, even if it's uncomfortable. And lastly, have the courage to speak up when you hear things that are racist. Racism should not be tolerated or ignored. Conversations about race, racism, and privilege need to happen in our workplaces, at our dinner tables, with our families, with our white friends, for a more equitable society. And the more we talk about racism and being anti-racist, others will feel more comfortable. As Martin Luther King once said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And I'd like to acknowledge that our Black colleagues matter. Their Black lives matter. Let's remind them that they matter with our commitment to anti-racism. I will end by saying anti-racism is not only the work of the Human Rights and Inclusion team, it's the work of organizational development, it's the work of leaders, it's the work of the front line. It's all of our responsibility to create a healthy workplace and safe place for patients and families to access equitable care. And anti-racism can be integrated into everything that we do, from policies to processes to interviewing, onboarding. We need to get creative about the ways in which we can take action. It's never too late to take a stance on human rights, equity, and inclusion, and begin the hard work towards building a healthier future and healthcare system with and for our Black physicians, staff, patients, and families. I hope you will join me and leave this webinar today with a commitment to anti-racism. Be the allies we all need. Be the leaders who are committed to structural and social change. Just be the difference that we can all aspire to at HHS. And I really urge you to have the courage to continue to have the difficult conversations that Jane will help build our capabilities in today, as we have the opportunity to affect change. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our webinar speaker for today, Jane Hastie. Jane is a longtime employee of Hamilton Health Sciences. During her 40 years with the organization, she has held many roles, both in clinical settings as well in administration. Jane is currently a patient experience specialist working in patient experience, quality and performance portfolio. Jane provides coaching and assists in facilitating difficult conversations, supporting patients, families, staff, and physicians in changing conversations and reimagining dialogue. As a certified crucial conversations facilitator, Jane uses this training to provoke new thinking and challenge old habits. She advocates for innovative thinking and options for dealing with difficult situations and difficult conversations. Working as a conflict coach, she assists parties to find ways to safely enter into dialogue and support ongoing conversations. Jane's expertise is focused on conflict system design, mediation, conflict analysis, and conflict coaching. Jane is a graduate of Osgoode Law School at York University with a Master's of Law specializing in alternative dispute resolution. Jane is currently a part-time faculty member at Humber College, teaching in the ADR program. And she also has published a risk management guide through the Ontario Minor Hockey Association with a particular attention to dispute resolution. Jane, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ash. On a couple of points, first and foremost, for your allyship and your brilliance in the conversation that you opened us up to. Thank you for that. It is my delight to be here today and to be with colleagues and friends that I have truly missed over the last few months. And so I'm happy to be able to have conversation with you today, to raise our spirits, to get reattached to this concept of difficult conversations, and to be open to reimagining the way in which we need to express those difficult things that are happening in and around, not just in our hospital, but in our community and around the nation as well. I saw a great quote that said, from Martin Luther King, that said, "Riots are the language of the unheard." And that really spoke to me, because part of what I wanted to talk to you today is about how we learn to speak up and to speak up well. And so we do have an opportunity to re-engage in our thinking, to re-engage in the way that we frame our conversations, to get to the emotion in a way that we talk about it as opposed to acting it out. And so that's really my hope today, definitely to recognize and understand that there are much diversity of emotions that are happening for our leaders, for our employees, physicians, patients, and families. I've seen in the chat box, comments about what folks are feeling, but we certainly know that fear, that guilt, that grief, anger, sadness, these are very raw emotions that are very present and really define a different way that we need to open up conversations for ourselves and for others around us. So let's join together in this journey to see how we can, as we say, reimagine conversations. So this quote is taken, I felt it was an important time to recognize that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And in saying that, mainly just to say, we didn't recognize a pandemic. I in my 40 years never thought I would be putting pandemic and peace in one sentence together, but here we are. I know that when I first started to work from home, I asked myself to start thinking, what is it that I need to be thinking about? What will I want to know and remember 12 months down the road? What will I wish I had measured, or what should I have said? And that really stuck with me, that I needed to really re-examine myself in the midst of a crisis, but also taking time to consider what the learnings are going to be, how I can impact and influence changes as we move forward. So the intention of this session today, and again, thank you for taking time away from your busy schedules to be a part of this, but I think it is to not blame ourselves for having difficult conversations that have gone awry, but rather to examine what we can do differently moving forward. So finding our peace in a pandemic, again, I think there's no need for me to go into understanding COVID-19. You're all the experts in understanding this better than I. But I do think that clearly COVID-19 is here. It's not going away magically, as some have suggested. It is, in fact, an era-defining challenge to all of our healthcare systems, and of course to our global economy. And we will have no idea the extent to which it will engage us in conflicts, or to the extent of which conflicts will develop because of COVID-19. We know that prior to the pandemic entering our systems, that we were, as an organization, really challenged already with fragility, that there was a large sense of overwhelm with staff who were struggling with day-to-day practices, leaders who were overwhelmed with decision-making, budgetary issues, and really just dealing with highly stressed humans. And all of that, we need to figure out, I guess now, the best way I can say it is, how do we dance with this thing called COVID-19? It's a unique partner at this point. We really want to be thinking about replacing old habits with new habits, starting to really focus on new ways of doing our business, new ways of providing care. And I think with that comes learning how to prioritize differently, deciding what is most important for me to do today, what is it that I want, and how do I effectively put that into my day-to-day practices in conversations that I need to have. Just when we thought we were busy and overwhelmed, along came this virus with all its fury, and change has been fast-paced, often challenged our thinking, our ethical practice. Moral distress is much more in tune for folks, and at the same time fearing that we're going to become sick or that we're going to take home sickness to our families and loved ones. Leaders have never been more challenged. Managing multiple conflicts, difficult decision-making, assisting staff with their sense of overwhelm, while balancing the need to continue to provide the best care for our patients and of course our families, or their families. And knowing that the pandemic will change and test our own personal integrity, our sense of humility, and our tolerance. This webinar was really an opportunity to offer our leaders a place to pause, to reset, and to reimagine conversations. So what will your piece be? Reimagining conversations, interesting concept. Recently listened to a wonderful webinar by Joseph Grenny from Crucial Conversations, and he stated that to succeed in a condition of ongoing pandemic, you will need a culture of unprecedented candor and accountability. And I'm really going to focus my discussion today on those three words: unprecedented candor and accountability. We really need to have a diligent focus on speaking up, and on top of that, learning to ensure that we are speaking up well, so that one conversation is what the intention is. We don't have to have 3 or 4 conversations on the same topic to get something resolved. We don't have time for that. We need to get to this feeling of peace. So the way in which we go about doing that, or the accountability piece of this, is really trying to reimagine self and your capacity to motivate, or sorry, and to understand your motive for entering into a conversation. These are key practices in reinventing conversation for ourselves. Know thyself. Ash, need to change that slide. Thanks. So this is actually an exercise that I often do in sessions, and so we're not going to do it as an exercise, but I will ask you to consider this. Best self, worst self is an opportunity to examine yourself. And I have to say that this has been, again, this was a gift for myself in entering into this pandemic, to really stop and pause and understand what I want it to be. Understanding that we have all experienced our best self. We know what conditions are required for us to act and be our best self. For me, I know it's having a good night's sleep, having my coffee first thing in the morning, a nice breakfast, enjoying aspects of my day, perhaps, that allow me to bring out that best self. You have to decide what that is for yourself. To look at what my strengths and qualities are, and to examine them myself and make sure that I draw upon those strengths and qualities so that I can continue to be my best self, not only in conversation, but just in general spirit. To know that when I'm my best self, that the impact I have on those around me will be important and valuable for them. Hedging towards a worse self creates a different level of impact. So I have short periods of time that I need to be able to influence well. So the best way to do that is to maintain my best self. And then when it comes to emotion, when I'm acting in my best self, I'm able to speak about what the emotion is. I'm not acting it out. If I'm frustrated, I'm able to speak about my frustration in a way that will be meaningful to the other person for their understanding and hopefully their participation as well. And then I would say that, you know, if you look at worst self, you understand the reasons for which these things happen, for which we move out of best self and into worst self. And all of us can appreciate that we have done this, that we have found ourselves going to a place that we really didn't want to go to, but because of our level of tolerance, because of some of the systems or the triggers that are happening around us, we fall short of meeting the mark of being our best self. So I ask you to consider your focus to be more on best self. When you start to feel like your impact is not working as well, when you start to feel that you're unable to get to those strengths and qualities, come back to the place that says, what is it that I want? What is it that I want to be? How do I want to influence? And to really remain focused on being our best self. Again, as you can tell, Joseph Grenny is someone who I read and listen to a lot, and again was intrigued with his comment, our biggest breakthroughs generally come after our biggest breakdowns. And I want to think about this in terms of, similar to the last slide, talking about our best self and worst self. I think we recognize that when we've gone to our worst self, those are outcomes and conversations that we kick ourselves for. You know, we say, I shouldn't have done that, or I went down a path that made this worse, or boy, I don't want to go back and have that conversation again. And so I think it is an opportunity, and especially as we are in this world of pandemic, when we have very limited time, you know, to try and have these difficult conversations. So we need to be thoughtful, taking time to pause and reset and recognize if we've done something that we're not happy with, ultimately, we have another path to choose, and we can go back and do that as part of our movement forward. There are more than one virus going on right now. The COVID is one virus. A second virus, I think, is related to interpersonal things that are happening in our workforce. It's called the culture of silence. And we do know that employees avoid speaking up about emotionally and politically risky issues. And so, you know, we're getting through our day, we're getting a lot of work done. The care is outstanding. And yet people are suffering, and the silence, unfortunately, can be very damaging to teams, to organizations. And so we need to be able to work on dealing with this particular virus as well. And the third virus that speaks up is the culture of collusion, which is really about employees adopting a code of silence together. And this can be very ineffective, of course, when we're dealing with the need to be a team, to move forward, and to have, as I have continued to say, great conversations. I know as one of the objectives, I said that we would just focus on a few fundamental aspects of conflict. And what I would like to say is fundamentals for conflict resolution come in many shapes and sizes, but certainly getting to yes speaks to the fundamentals of negotiation. When you're talking about dealing with a difficult conversation, there's usually a negotiation involved. Someone thinks that they're more right than the other person. And so these basic principles are just here to reinforce to you, don't forget that these are important for us to be considering as we go into a difficult conversation. So separating the people from the problem, focusing on interests, not positions. We understand that what we're trying to do is not remove emotion, but being able to speak about emotion. That changes a conversation. It allows you to move it forward. Inventing options for mutual gain. There's nothing finer than being able to have a collaborative approach to looking at decisions, mutual purpose, at the end of the day, mutual respect, two variables that have to be present in order for us to work on conflict resolution, difficult conversations. And then insist on using objective criteria. We have rules, policy, guidelines, codes of conduct. They are there for purposefulness. Sometimes we read them differently. And it's important to be able to go to those things when we're really feeling stuck and unable to get to a place where there's some common purpose to move forward. So use that objective criteria when it is required. The second piece of fundamental aspects would be getting to crucial conversations. And crucial conversations really sets out some primary objectives, and I've just tried to break down some of the ones that I think are key as we are talking about difficult conversations. The state model, for sure, is a model that allows us to break down a difficult conversation into very easy, well, I say easy, but principled approaches to having a difficult conversation. Starting with stating the facts, making sure that we speak directly to what is it that I see, what is it that I hear, that we're being very focused on behaviorally specific issues that we are concerned about. We want to tell the story in a way, again, that is not going to make someone defensive, but rather honor what your truth is, what you are seeing and hearing. And then asking the person to join you in that conversation by asking a question, again, without judgment, that allows them to feel a sense of you actually do want to hear what I have to say, and that perhaps together we can come to some kind of a place of mutual purpose. We did this by talking tentatively, by choosing our words well. Not using hot words is a terminology that people say, so just be mindful of those choices of words that we use. And of course, encourage testing. And encourage testing is a fancy way of asking questions. Asking questions help to engage people. So I'm just seeing someone ask for some examples, but when we're talking about, for example, talking tentatively and choosing not hot words, I'm thinking about, don't use words like war-like terminology. We're going into battle, we're using even forms of profanity, which I know people feel that they don't use, but be mindful how we are using our tone in difficult conversations, because our emotions start to creep up. We need to be mindful of that. Encourage testing, again, as I said, it's asking questions. So you're asking folks to engage in a conversation with you, inviting them, welcoming them into the conversation. Again, not because they need to be defensive, but rather, I want to know and learn your truth. Help me to understand what that is. The next one is, if you don't talk it out, you will act it out. It's a primary function of crucial conversations to say, we can't be acting out our emotions. We're not going to get very far if we do that. So we need to get back to talking it out, using our language skills to be able to, as I mentioned earlier, if I'm frustrated, I need to talk about what the frustration is, not act it out. If I'm angry about something, being able to be specific about what I'm angry about, observable behaviors, observable or actual facts that we can use to help to demonstrate where that anger is coming from. The third one is really speaking about unhealthy and healthy motives for having conversation. And I'm going to go into that one in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So I won't go into a lot of that right now. But the fourth one is a question that I really want you to write down, put on your desk, and say to yourself as you're going into a difficult conversation, what is it that I really want? It does help to redefine how you will enter into a conversation and how you will exit out of a conversation. You'll know when you're ready to exit out, because hopefully you've been able to get what it is that you're looking for. For the most part, again, that comes back to mutual purpose and mutual respect. So this is one of my favorite slides actually from Crucial Conversations. And again, it's one of those slides that I say to folks, this is very much a my best self, my worst self scenario. Unhealthy motives really reflect our worst self. When we go into a conversation wanting to be right, when we go into a conversation trying to look good or to save face, to win, to punish or to blame, or to avoid conflict. And a lot of the last piece, avoiding conflict, happens a lot in our organization. And in particular, as we're dealing with a pandemic, when there's a primary focus on issues and concerns that are related to that, we avoid issues of conflict that are potentially brewing, festering, and it is important that we try to get to those. So unhealthy motives, not helpful, and yet we are often ourselves victims to fall into traps that take us to these unhealthy motives. What we're really wanting to focus on is creating healthy motives for dialogue. And again, this comes back to being our best self, knowing what we want. I think you go into a conversation knowing that you want to learn something, that you're not coming in with all the information and I'm the expert, but rather I'm here to learn, I'm here to understand what your story is. I'm here to find the truth, and the truth might be my truth and your truth and a combination of both, but let's figure it out together and feel comfortable that we have the story correct. That's part of a difficult conversation. We know that we're able to finish a conversation when we produce results. So you can finish a conversation and know that a behavior is going to change because folks understand there's a reason for it and it's necessary. And maybe I need to learn to change something about my behavior as well. So it's a two-way street. It's about strengthening relationships. The worst thing we could do right now, and certainly in a pandemic, is see damaged relationships grow. It's far better for us. We need these partnerships. We need to be able to dialogue openly with candor, to express ourselves, to speak up, but to speak up well. And the last one, which I think is so important, and just to keep at the forefront of our thinking, is this concept of humility and the importance of us recognizing that we might not be right, and that what we're learning from someone else will help us in our journey to get to resolution in a difficult conversation. I do quickly just want to note that the webinar that Joseph Grenny and Vital Smarts presented has some interesting statistics about gaps when we're not speaking up to issues and concerns or not having those difficult conversations. I found it quite interesting to understand some of the costs of lag time when we decide I'm not going to have that conversation today and I'm going to wait, and how that creates additional costs to an organizations, to relationships, to teams. So they're suggesting, anywhere from 1 day to 3 days, there's likely a cost of around $5,000. Now, don't forget that's American dollars, so it's a lot more from a Canadian dollar perspective. But think about what that means. It's about unproductivity. It's about how people engage in that, as I talked about, the team collusion, more people becoming engaged emotionally, becoming detached from care practices, errors happening. Those are the things that they're talking about in terms of costs. And of course, when they talk about waiting longer than 5 days, those costs are tripling. Tripling, more than that actually, $25,000 over 5 days. When I think about difficult conversations and those I've helped with coaching, I know that there are some conversations that people wait for a very long time to have because it's difficult, because they're uncomfortable, because they don't feel they have the skills. I'm wanting to re-engage you in that thinking. You do have the skills, your best self, you have the ability to have these conversations. Lag time is one of the worst things that we could see happen during a pandemic, but during any time in our work time.
Jane, I'm just wondering if we can pause. I see a comment from Erica, and she indicates that she finds it really hard when ideologies appear really different and can feel at odds with values, and learning to understand the other perspective is so important and really challenging at sometimes.
Erica, that's a great point. It's interesting. I was thinking about values and different values that people experience in crucial conversation, difficult conversations. In a pandemic, it's interesting that there is universally a common value that creeps up, and that is survival. So when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we understand that survival is the very first thing that we're trying to achieve. Across the world right now during pandemic, people are finding commonality in, I need to have a job, I don't have a job, I need to get money, I need to get food, I need to provide shelter. And this becomes very, very challenging when we are fearful of the potential of losing a job, speaking up to something that might, again, challenge the status quo and put me in danger of, again, losing my job. So I think that that's one thing. I think the diversity of where people are coming from today also invariably creates difficulties with difficult conversations. But that part of having a difficult conversation means asking what is important to you, so that I can understand that and help to move the conversations. Not just what I want in the conversation. I want to ask the other person, what is it that you want? What is it that you need in order to move through this difficult conversation? Hopefully that's answered it or given you some perspective, Erica. All right, so leaders, in order to survive and thrive in the months ahead, you need a culture that is. So COVID resistant is a term we're trying to utilize to say that we need an opportunity, or we have an opportunity right now, to influence behaviors that will make your employees, our physicians, our patients, and our families be safe and feel safe. And also at the same time doing what we do best, providing great care, best care to all in this ongoing pandemic. The second piece of this moves to recovery and acceleration. This is about learning how to pivot quickly. So think about this in terms of, we recognize that there's an issue or a concern. I think one of the things we ask is that you actually come to that discussion much more quickly than what we would have done in the past, you know, where we have to think about it, make a plan, set up a time, that maybe we start to reimagine conversations happening in the moment, in the spot. Mentoring our staff to let them know that it's okay and safe to raise something that is difficult, and that we can talk about it and talk about it openly. So pivot quickly in different ways, so that we're doing our business, providing care in a different perspective, really changing those conversations. And the third piece, which has been a really hard one, is this concept of virtually adapted. And I mean, we're moving to different ways of communicating. I was always one to say you should never have a crucial conversation on a phone, on an email. And yet I'm learning that we are having to move in some of these directions just because of a pandemic and the way in which we are needing to check in with each other. It can be done. We have to sort of move away from old culture thinking to new culture thinking. And again, this is about creating, I'm going to say, a bit of a resilience to how do I create a culture that is capable of pivoting quickly to different ways of doing our business, providing care, changing and reimaging these difficult conversations. and changing our previous habits. So I think we're going to pause for a quick poll. Yeah, so what's getting in the way? Are there interpersonal, emotional, or politically sensitivities that get in the way of candidly discussing and quickly deciding on the bold changes we need? So I'm not sure if people, Ash, are able to vote on this. Is that actually happening?
Yep, folks are voting right now.
Okay, great.
So for the first question, we're seeing people are strongly agreeing, 96%. So 79 folks responded to that. And then for number 2, in the situation, what gets in the way of a completely transparent and effective communication? It's a bit of a mix. So the highest is mistrust, so 34%. Past histories of conflict at 19%, worries about job security, 14%, our tendency to involve too many or too few people. And then I'm seeing 13% in other, concern about losing power. So I would encourage folks to, for those who noted other, if you can use the chat box at this time just to identify what are some of the other things that might be getting in the way of having those transparent and effective conversations. So I'm not seeing anything, so. Okay, all options were present, so I didn't pick just one. Lack of close proximity and being able to have one-on-one conversations.
Yeah.
Great.
All
wanting to say the right thing, not being confident, shift worker unions, yeah, so valid.
Yeah. So, Ash, I just want to go back to the first question that 79%, I think you said, answered strongly agree.
96%.
Sorry, 96%. Wow. Well, doesn't make me feel very encouraged. And yet at the same time, I understand that people are suffering. And so some of this speaking up, I think, becomes problematic. I think people do feel that their voice may not be heard. And at the same time, making that decision, making that habit of telling ourselves that story potentially restricts us from opening up the dialogue. And so I want you to be rethinking about this, even though, I mean, it's easy for me to say, sure, speak up to your VP, speak up to your director, speak up to your manager. But there may be things that are interfering with your sense of safety to do so. And I'm certainly seeing some of that in the comments that are coming up here. So we need to own some of this. We need to take some accountability and understanding, how can I change the conversation so that I will feel safe? Do I need some help and support in being able to raise a question or concern? And so to look for those opportunities with colleagues, if you feel that you can have a crucial conversation with your higher authority, and then if it needs to go higher, how they can be supporting you in having that conversation. Sometimes you need to go to a third party and ask them to actually go and ask the question, and that's okay. None of this we're not shaming you for not being willing to open up a conversation. It's more understanding that, okay, I understand that I am holding back, withholding some of that information. Okay, moving to silence, I would say.
So Jane,
Thank you for all of those comments. Anything else, Ash, that?
Yeah, I just see one more question. So as a leader, you can hear what your staff are saying. However, some of their expectations are unrealistic or impossible to collaborate on. How do you make these kinds of situations work?
That's a great question. And I come back to some principles again in Crucial Conversations that says, first of all, we have to recognize and appreciate mutual respect. So being able to have the conversation, acknowledging what we're hearing, making sure that they're choosing words and phrases that are not demanding as such, but that are respectful and that allow us to enter safely into the conversation. And the next part is to make sure that we can sometimes restate, paraphrase what folks are saying, to engage in understanding what is the mutual purpose, what is it that you really want, and what is it that I really want. Ultimately, I'm always amazed at how difficult conversations can be, and ultimately when we get to resolution, parties wanted the same thing, but we have a hard time expressing that. And so opening up those questions, you'll recall we talked about encouraging testing. So opening questions up that will, again, create a safety net for folks to answer a question and use their voice to speak up to what it is that is causing them distress, causing them to feel unsafe. Easier said than done, but those would be the principles that I would utilize. I think, and maybe as we move to this next slide, that this would also be useful for folks in terms of understanding, remaining genuine and authentic is what we want to do as leaders. And it's so important because we present that and hopefully it resonates with our staff and those we are talking to, our patients and our families as well, that they will see that and recognize the value of them staying genuine and staying authentic as they present their issues and concerns. So we talk about getting unstuck, stop having debates. Sometimes those are debates that are going on in our own mind. And so I appreciate that we're great storytellers. Sometimes our stories are not helpful. And so we need to stop dithering about. We need to stop the denial piece. Let's get on with it. Recognize those things that are seemingly undiscussables, or in some people call them sacred cows. What hill are we willing to, the terminology, die on? But I want you to be thinking about what do I feel safest in having this conversation with or about? And if it's not worth a conversation, is it worth the energy that I'm putting into trying to decide if I need to have this conversation or not? Watch for and be mindful of silent collusion. As I've already identified, this is another, we'll call it virus, that is infiltrating or has the potential to infiltrate, certainly when a pandemic is apparent. People don't know when there's the right time to speak up. And so groups start to form, they have their own little conversations. It can be very destructive to teams, divisive. And so, I encourage leaders to change it up, ask questions that you haven't asked before that might promote conversations. Use your huddle formats for those who are in CQI mode as a place to enter into some of that conversation. Stop yourself from irrational slashing. Understand what the real issue is that stands between you and progress, or you and that difficult conversation. I know it. I know that I have found myself telling myself stories about individuals, probably really negative, thoughts in my head, and that changes my desire, and it changes the words and phrases I'm going to use in that conversation. So get away from doing that. Use motives for dialogue, healthy motives for dialogue, as your guidance for moving forward. This is the part about speaking up with candor, right? And then the last piece is about accountability. So we talk about having candor when we speak up. We also need to talk about, excuse me, accountability steps for leaders. And I think that this is also important for us to go back to very fundamental aspects of dealing with difficult conversations. We need to describe the gap. Ash, this is the next slide, sorry, that I've moved to. This is describing the expected versus the observed. So, you know, as a leader, you're seeing staff, you're observing them doing one thing, you have a different expectation. That's a gap. That's the discussion. Rather than having the historical aspect of Sally Sue, who's been a terrible employee for all these years, let's just deal with this conversation at this moment and see if that helps to build some capacity for different conversations. Focus on the facts. Focus on the facts. Try to separate the emotion out. Speak to the emotion, but let's not act it out. As I indicated before, remove hot words from your discussion. So be practiced in the use of your words and phrases. You know, start thinking of more collaborative terminology, peaceful terminology. That will engage the person that you're trying to have the conversation with in a different way as well. And get curious. How do I make sure my employees or the physicians or patients are safe? Let's ask some questions about that. If people aren't safe, they're not going to speak up. How do I make sure my employees, physicians, and patients feel safe? Again, asking questions. If you don't feel safe, is there something that I can do to support you, to change the conversation, to change the location of the conversation? What can I do to be helpful here? And then the third one, resilience. How do I create a culture that is capable of pivoting quickly to different ways so doing business or providing our best care can happen? And the last piece that I just want to resonate on for a moment is the power of habit. And I took the opportunity being at home to order a book that I've been wanting to read for a while, The Power of Habit. Within the scope of this book is quite meaningful for me. It really combined crucial conversations with understanding why I do things, and we all have habits for sure. So in this case, the quote that comes in, this process within our brains is a 3-step loop. First, there's a cue, a trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use. So we've done that to ourselves. We have habits that we have used in past for crucial conversations or difficult conversations. Sometimes we ignore them, we put them aside. Sometimes we leap right into them, full of emotion, and it's our habit. And for whatever reason, there has been a reward, and that's why we go back to the same old, same old. There's an opportunity here for us to change that. The author of The Power of Habits, Charles Duhigg, I think is his pronunciation, writes that once we choose who we want to be, and that's an important component. Again, who do we want to be? Our best self. That's important for us to consider. People grow to the way in which they have been exercised. Just as a sheet of paper or a coat once creased or folded tends to fall forever afterwards into the same identical folds. I find that very powerful because we're used to pattern, we're used to our habits, but we can change our habits. And the pandemic and this concept of bringing peace allows us to change our habits. Remember that a habit comes because the result of having a reward. You have all had great conversations. You've all done difficult conversations before, and you need to be remembering that those great conversations created opportunities for you to ask different questions, to develop your relationships, to build new and different habits for yourself. We have to remember the reward or we won't do it. So reimagining your difficult conversations in a way that allow you to get to all of these particular points. Get to the facts. Explain your understanding. Make sure that there's clarity and genuine and authentic understanding presented. Listen to the other's perspective. Okay, and again, try not to misinterpret what people are saying. If you hear people going to blame or defensiveness, try to encourage them to change their words and phrases as well. Be present as your best self and help the other person to become their best self too in the conversation. Remember to look for mutual purpose, to ensure that mutual respect is present. And most importantly, use this as an opportunity to change your habits. Let's get to peace in this pandemic. That's it from my end.
Thank you so much, Jane. So
I will tell you that when I practiced yesterday, it was an hour and a half. So I don't know. I think I either left out a whole bunch or I just got quicker.
So in the interest of time, I do see one question or comment in the chat box. So if we don't have the voices of underrepresented in leadership or decision-making positions, how do those that remain to be systematically erased engage in conversations when they may not be at the table, when folks may not be at the table with lived experiences?
That is a great question. And I have felt that in my time in this organization over the years. I think the one thing that changed for me is that I don't have to be at all the tables, that my voice is important and that I raise my voice to as many people as I can who are also influential and can carry my voice forward as well. So it's not just me having to sit at a decision-making table, but that I've been able to influence well others who also have voice and share issues and concerns and can take that forward. If we don't feel that we've been able to reach folks, that they're not presenting your voice, we also want to think about perhaps how we are delivering the message. Maybe we need to deliver the message differently because people aren't listening to it. Remember, I talked about we have to be able to speak up, but to speak up well. People will listen when we're speaking up well. So it allows us an opportunity for self-check here, accountability. What is it that I'm saying? If I have to say something 3 or 4 times, I'm probably not saying it well. So let me go back to the table, rethink about the words and phrases I'm going to choose to use. Think about how I can influence others who are also going to be at tables for discussion and decision making, and see if that helps to make our voice louder. Is that helpful?
So I'm also seeing other folks chime in. So the common theme is that we need to leverage our colleagues. It's not just horizontal. And I think this speaks to what I was saying earlier. We really need to tap into people. When we think about allyship, we are all in this together. Let's tap into the people. Let's leverage those openings to have those difficult conversations. And let's go to the folks who are the champions. We can make a difference in these conversations. There's just one more.
And I was just going to say, let's not forget that this difficult conversations were present before pandemic. Trust with individuals in the organization was low. The way in which people went to silence was high, all pre-pandemic. And so it has only created more silence pandemic. As much as, there are amazing work being done, please don't take that the wrong way. Amazing work, amazing care practices. We are truly blessed with our staff and leaders in this organization who have taken this on with incredible spirit. But there's work to be done, and we do have to make changes to creating better trust, to create opportunities for voices to be heard, to become more collaborative. when it comes to decision making and difficult conversations. Sorry, Ash.
No, that's okay. And I think that's a common theme that's coming up in the chat box, is that one of the biggest hurdles is that we have to be able to build trust. And in terms of the surveys that we have engaged folks in the organization, one of the messages that comes out of that is that people don't have trust, and so it makes it so much more difficult to have the conversation. So with that said, I appreciate that we have come to time, and I want to honor that for folks. If there are any other questions that are coming up for people, I would really encourage you to email leadershipcoaching@hhsc.ca. We're here to support you. We're happy to answer your questions. And I just want to thank Jane at this time for an amazing webinar. Jane, you were my leader and mentor for 3 years, and my colleagues and I continue to be stretched and benefit from your wisdom, your knowledge, your expertise, and your deep compassion and commitment to justice. Today, you've given us many tactical strategies to pause, reimagine difficult conversations, and if I may, help give us the courage to enter into them with more confidence. So thank you, thank you. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next webinar, which is on team dynamics from the front lines to the C-suite, tactical strategies to avoid pitfalls and optimize performance, which is on June 18th with Tony DeBono, same time, same place. And just stay tuned for the Leadership Learning Bites on June 11th with additional tools from this webinar. And really, I really encourage people to pause, reset, and nourish in this time that is so hard on all of us, and especially the Black community. These are heavy times, so do what makes sense for your soul. Take good care, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today.
Thanks, Ash.
Thank you.